Hey, Stewart's Chapel. This is Don Pierson and Don Counts, and we're at the Counts' home. And this is September 6th devotion, Monday, September the 6th. And we began Saturday, new series of devotions. There should be 14 of these on being burden bearers. Saturday, I read to you Oswald Chambers' devotion concerning Psalms 55, verse 22, about casting your burdens upon the Lord. I want to take you to Nehemiah chapter 1. And I want to present to you an example of an individual who takes on a burden that he could have easily escaped. I say that easily. Actually, I don't believe he could have easily escaped it, because I think it was a burden that was placed upon him by God. But at the same time, when you realize where he is and what happens, he's a good example of what you do when you have a burden. And so, I'm going to skip verse 1, mainly because there's a word in it that I can't pronounce. So I'll let you guys try that one. We'll start in verse 2. And Hanani, one of my brethren, some think that when it says brethren, another Israelite. Some say it's actually a blood kin. Doesn't matter. It's somebody that he knew. Hanani, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah. Now Nehemiah is he's in the under the Persian king in captivity because of God's people's sin and God's judgment or discipline upon him. So he's actually a slave, a cupbearer for the king at this time. And so these men came back from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the survivors who are left. That's interesting. The survivors who are left, that implies there's not many of them, from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. Now look what happens. So it was when I heard these words that I sat down and I wept and mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven, and I said, I pray, Lord God of heaven, O great and awesome God, you who keep your covenant and mercy with those who love you and observe your commandments. Please let your ear be attentive and your eyes open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before you now, day and night, for the children of Israel. Your servants and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we, notice he includes himself, which we have sinned against you. Both my father's house and I have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you, and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, nor the ordinances which you commanded your servant Moses. Remember, I pray, the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though some of you were cast out to the farthest part of the heavens, yet I will gather them from there and bring them to the place which I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. Now these are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, I pray, please let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayers of your servants who desire to fear your name. And let your servant, talking about himself, prosper this day. In other words, give me favor this day. I pray, and grant I, your servant, mercy in the sight of this man, that's the king, for I was the king's cupbearer. Well, the rest of the book of Nehemiah is only there because of God's response to this man's brokenness and prayer. It's interesting that Nehemiah hasn't seen it. He was aware that there might be some people that had survived the captivity, but he hadn't seen it. He hadn't walked in there. He's hundreds of miles away in this palace, being treated well by the king. He hasn't seen the devastation. He hasn't seen the situation of God's people. He just simply asked the question, how are they? But when he hears their situation, the situation of them being in great need, and not many of them, they're in captivity, they're a reproach. That means they're a reproach to God. God's name is not being held up in a way that would glorify Him. But also the walls and the gates are burned, which meant that there's no way to remove the reproach. The suffering, the enemy can come and go as he wants. There's no protection. There's no gates. There's nothing to hide behind. He hears it, and it crushes him. He takes a burden, not based on what he has seen, but what he has heard. You see, he took their situation personal. He took it personal. And he did something personal about it. You know, it's interesting that the ones who were able to talk about it and tell it, they don't seem to be moved. They're not the ones praying. They're not the ones fasting and weeping. I've noticed that that's often the case. Have you ever wondered how in the world can these news reporters that report such tragedy do so almost detached? Well, that's the way these guys were. They were reporting the news to Nehemiah and detached. Let me ask you something. Have you ever heard of a situation with an individual and just been broken? Now notice, this is not family. This is not family. Most of these people, he doesn't even know their names. He doesn't ask about how's Jeremiah or how's Matthew. He doesn't ask about individuals. They don't even give him any names. But he took it personal. In other words, the phrase that I often use, it messed him up. It messed him up. It messed him up in an incredible way. He is far removed from the situation in an elaborate palace. He could spend his whole life there, working and being cared for by the king. He's not in a state of suffering. His eyes aren't going to see the situation, but it messed him up. So, what can we learn from this in relationship to burdens? One, burdens come from different ways. Sometimes they come from what we see. Sometimes they come from what we hear. Sometimes they come by a movement of the Spirit of God in our life. Regardless of how God brings the burden to you, whether it be by your ears, your eyes, or the movement of the Spirit in your heart, burdens, when they come, we should receive them in a personal way. That's what he does. The other thing is, he knew the real problem. That's revealed in his prayer. He knew why they were in suffering. He knew that it was because of the sins of his fathers. But he also says, my own sin, our sin, I have sinned. He knew the real problem. The real problem, they had become a reproach and helpless. He basically declares or prays, Lord, send me. That's what he's asking. Lord, give me favor. Give me favor with this king. May I prosper with the king. And we know that next chapter, that's exactly what happens. The God gives him favor with the king. The king not only sends him, but the king sends him with a blessing and tons of authority. So, he received the burden in a personal way. He made it his. Second, He knew the main issue of the burden was that God's name was at stake. Third, he wanted to be used to help relieve the burden. So he asked God to send him. Fourth, he knew what to do. Now there's several things. You have to go through the rest of the book of Nehemiah to find out what he does. But Nehemiah has about 9 prayers. Some say there's 10. Now, just about every chapter in the book of Nehemiah has a prayer that is recorded of Nehemiah. Did you know there are more actual recorded prayers? Now, I'm not talking about where it says he prayed, but actual recordings of what he prayed of Nehemiah than there are of Jesus. More recorded prayers of Nehemiah in this little short book than there are Jesus. And Nehemiah is constantly asking God help in relationship to the burden. So he knew what to do. One, what did he do? He went to God. Second, he took on a responsibility for their sin. He says, I have sinned too. He went to God, he prayed. He confessed their sins. And then God showed him what to do. He needed to rebuild the walls. You see, Nehemiah is not building the walls. Nehemiah is rebuilding the walls. Very, very different. Almost every sermon I've ever heard from Nehemiah is some pastor talking about how God has called them to build a worship center, a family life center, an education center. Nehemiah, it's not about that. See, this is about stopping and removing the reproach. Building the walls stops the work of the enemy. You see, that was his burden. He didn't want the people to be oppressed anymore. God used him. He knew what to do. Do you know what to do? Do you take your burdens personal? Do you know what is the real issue behind the burden? How is God's name involved? When you bear your burden, have you asked God, have you said to God, okay, here am I. I'll take this burden and I'll bear it. You tell me what you want me to do with it. And then as God has instructed you to carry your burden and what you're to do with it, are you doing it? What are you doing with the burden that God has given you? Love you, Sears Chapel.